When Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned Emperor of France in 1804, he began the reformation of the armed forces, from what was commonly known as the Revolutionary Army into La Grande Armée, or the Great Army. It was initially formed from the Army of the Ocean Coasts, the army that Napoleon had assembled with the intention of invading Britain, and which consisted of about 600,000 men. The Emperor used the army to destroy the Austrians and the Russians at Ulm and Austerlitz after their threat of invasion, and then later against the various coalitions formed to defeat the French and her allies. In 1812, La Grande Armée reached its peak of around 685,000 men to invade Russia with the disastrous consequences. Although the name remained in place, the French army never reached this size again and was defeated in 1814 and during the 100 Days campaign in 1815. In this video, we're going to take a look at the organisation of the army and its separate components, namely the infantry, the cavalry, the artillery and the Imperial Guard. The infantry was the largest portion of the army and was divided into two types of infantrymen, the line infantry and the light infantry, with the line infantry making up the larger part of this force. In 1803, Napoleon reinstated the term regiment for any army formations below the brigade level. Previously, the Revolutionary Army had used the term demi-brigade, as there were two to a brigade. In the reforms, the regiments were numbered sequentially, and originally had 133 regiments de ligne, roughly corresponding with the number of departments in France. This number would eventually rise to 156 regiments. With 4 main battalions and 1 rear battalion, the regiment's paper strength was 3,970 men, including the various headquarters and support elements. The regiment was commanded by a colonel, and the regimental headquarters comprised 50 men, including various officers, quartermasters, paymasters, surgeons, musicians and craftsmen. Also, the headquarters was where the regimental eagle and the flag was to be found. However, despite having a paper strength, regiments varied in size throughout the Napoleonic Wars due to different circumstances, but most are based around a formation of 4 battalions in the field. Battalions numbered at 840 men on paper, divided into companies. The size of the battalion was only a paper strength, and very few ever reached their allotted amount throughout the wars. This was due to casualties, sickness, desertion and any other number of factors. The usual strength of a battalion on campaign was about 400 to 600 men. Prior to the reforms of 1804, the battalion consisted of 8 fusilier companies and 1 grenadier company. In 1804, this changed to 7 fusilier companies, 1 grenadier company and 1 voltigeur company. Further reforms in 1808 led to the number of fusilier companies dropping to 4, with 1 grenadier company and 1 voltigeur company. Each company consisted of 140 men and was commanded by a captain, with subordinate officers and non-commissioned officers, a quartermaster general and 2 drummers. The rank and file consisted of 121 privates. The size of companies also rose from 121 men to 140 in 1808 after the reforms, which reduced the number of companies in a battalion. Fusiliers made up the majority of the regiment and the army, and they can be considered the typical infantrymen of La Grande Armée. They were armed with a Charleville 1777 pattern musket and bayonet. They were trained in marching at speed and endurance. They also were trained to fire at close-range targets rather than the mass volleys of some of the other European armies at the time. They wore a bicorn until 1807, when it was replaced with a shako, a blue tunic with white lapels and red collars and cuffs over a white surcoat and white trousers. The pom-pom on the hat showed which company the soldier belonged to: dark green for the 1st company, sky blue for the 2nd, orange for the 3rd and violet for the 4th. The grenadiers were the elite formation within the battalion, consisting of the tallest and the strongest men. Newly formed battalions did not have a grenadier company, but Napoleon ordered that one should be formed after the battalion had fought in 2 campaigns, consisting of the men who had shown the greatest strength and courage. Regulations decreed that the men of the grenadier companies wore moustaches and a bearskin, but the bearskin was replaced with a shako in 1807. However, many grenadier companies retained their bearskins after this date. Carrying the same musket as the fusiliers, the grenadiers also carried a small sabre that was intended for close-quarter fighting, but was used for cutting wood at campfires more often than not. The grenadier company was placed on the right of the battalion. Traditionally, this was thought to be the place of great honour since hoplite times and the less defended part of the shield line. Grenadier companies were also drawn off to form grenadier battalions and formed the vanguard of the attack as a shock formation. The voltigeurs were the other elite formation within the battalion. Meaning leaper or vaulter, this formation was made up of the most agile and smallest men. The voltigeur companies were formed in 1805 and were second only to the grenadiers in the hierarchy of the battalion. The name came from the original intention that they would be able to leap onto the horses of friendly cavalry for faster movement. Obviously, this was completely impractical in practice, but the name remained. Their training emphasised marksmanship and quick movement and made them ideal as a battalion's skirmishers and scouts as well as operating as a battalion's light infantry. To differentiate them from the rest of the battalion, they wore long plumes on their bicorns. This was changed in 1807 to red-lined shakos with plumes. The plumes were then later replaced with pom-poms. The voltigeurs were originally to be equipped with a short cavalry carbine, but this never happened in practice, and they also carried the 1777 pattern musket along with the short sabre, similar to the grenadiers. When in combat, the voltigeur company took a position on the left of the battalion, traditionally the second most honourable position in battle. The light infantry of the Grande Armée was organised along similar lines to the line infantry, but differed in training and names. Only 36 regiments of light infantry were raised, and they were trained in marksmanship and rapid movement with an emphasis on skirmishing compared to the line infantry. Because of this training, they were generally used as skirmish screens at the vanguard of the army. They saw considerable action and had a flamboyant attitude and uniform to match. The carabiniers à pied in the light battalions mirrored the grenadier companies in the line battalions. These men had the same duties and the training of their line equivalents, but as light troops. The voltigeurs of the light battalion were similar to the voltigeurs in the line battalions and performed the same duties. The bulk of the light battalion were the chasseurs or hunters. They had a darker blue tunic than the line battalions to help with camouflage, but otherwise wore a similar, if somewhat more flamboyant, uniform. The infantry was the largest part of La Grande Armée throughout its formation, and these were the men that bore the brunt of the fighting and the greatest casualties during the Napoleonic Wars. As with all the armies of the early 19th century, the French cavalry was used for a number of battlefield roles, including scouting, skirmishing, harassing the flanks and shock attack amongst others. For these roles, the cavalry was organised into different units to undertake the various tasks assigned to it. Cavalry was organised into regiments like the infantry, but they were much smaller in number, with about 800 to 1200 horsemen in each. These were then organised into 2 or 3 escadrons or squadrons, which in turn consisted of 2 companies. The first squadron in light and dragoon cavalry regiments were designated as elite. This was probably because the best men and horses were placed in this squadron. Despite the loss in experience due to the French Revolution and the execution and replacement of aristocratic officers and NCOs from the pre-revolutionary cavalry, Napoleon was able to rebuild the cavalry arm, and it was arguably the finest in Europe until 1812. The French cavalry of La Grande Armée was similar to the infantry, in that it was organised into light and heavy components, and each of these had 3 distinct types of cavalry troops. The carabiniers à cheval were organised into 2 regiments and can be considered the elite heavy cavalry of La Grande Armée. Their uniforms were similar to the mounted grenadiers of the Imperial Guard, with bearskins and long blue coats. They were mounted on black horses prior to 1813. The carabiniers à cheval were mostly used as shock attack cavalry for close quarter combat. In 1809 they were mauled by Austrian Uhlans, and Napoleon ordered that they should then wear armour to help defence against enemy cavalry. Initially, the carabiniers refused until a special type of armour was produced, and this was bronze for added impact on the battlefield. Despite this and their elite status, the carabiniers were defeated by Russian Cossacks in 1812 and then were panicked by Hungarian hussars at Leipzig in 1813. Cuirassiers were the first heavy cavalry to wear armour in the form of a breastplate and helmet. The armour would not stop a musket ball fired directly, but could deflect against ricochet, long-range shots and even pistol shots. However, it was designed to deflect against swords and lancers and was useful in close combat with enemy cavalry formations. Because of the weight of the armour, the cuirassiers were generally large and strong men mounted on large and strong horses. The heaviness of the formation allowed them to put a lot of weight behind a battlefield charge, making them useful as shock troops. When Napoleon ascended to emperor, there were 25 cuirassier regiments, but they were severely under strength. Napoleon's reforms reduced this initially to 12, taking the best men from the existing regiments to form the new ones. Later, 3 more regiments were added, bringing the final total to 15 cuirassier regiments. The dragoons made up the largest part of the heavy cavalry of La Grande Armée. Although they were medium-weight cavalry, they were officially designated as heavy. They carried sabres and muskets with bayonets, which allowed them to fight on foot as infantry should the need arise. However, this practice on the battlefield had dropped off in the decades before the Napoleonic Wars, but the dual training continued, which meant an inevitable drop-off in standards of both aspects. Initially, there were 25 regiments of dragoons, but this was then raised to 30. By the time of Waterloo campaign in 1815, however, only 15 dragoon regiments could be fully equipped. The light cavalry regiments were deployed in a number of ways, mainly as skirmishers and scouts, and their light status ensured that they were perfectly adapted to these roles. The hussars were the most flamboyant and reckless of the light cavalry, and regarded themselves as the best horsemen of La Grande Armée. As scouts, they were perfect to screen the movements of the rest of the army and report back to their commanders enemy troop movements and dispositions. They were also used in the harassing role, pursuing a fleeing enemy in the field of battle. In 1804, there were 10 regiments of hussars, rising to 13 by 1830. The chasseurs à cheval, or mounted hunters, had an identical role to the hussars, and were even armed with the same pistol and sabre. They wore an infantry-style shako and green uniform, so had a less flamboyant look than the hussars. In 1811 there were 31 regiments of the chasseurs, making them the most numerous of the Napoleonic cavalry. Of these, 6 regiments also consisted of Flemish, Swiss, Italians and Germans. The final formation of the light cavalry were the lancers. The Polish lancers were the most feared of Napoleon's mounted units. With speed equal to the hussars, a shock attack similar to cuirassier, and a versatility similar to the dragoons, they represented some of the best cavalry in Europe. Not including the regiment of lancers in the Imperial Guard, 9 in total were raised. Initially, all of the horsemen were armed with lancers, but battlefield experience and then examples drawn from Polish tactics meant that only the front rank had lancers and the rear ranks were armed with carbines. The lance was particularly effective against infantry in squares, as it went beyond the reach of the musket with a bayonet attached. They were also used to hunt down a defeated enemy, the lance being used to dispatch the wounded without the horseman having to leave his saddle. Napoleon was an artillery officer before rising to become emperor, meaning that great emphasis was placed on the arm within the Grande Armée. Revolutions in artillery development by General Grival in the 18th century meant that the French cannon were lighter, they were easier to sight and also easier to fire. They had better carriages and were standardised calibers than had previously been the case. This in turn allowed La Grande Armée to use them to maximum effect, with the mobility to concentrate fire where it was needed on the battlefield. Napoleon often also grouped cannons together into large batteries to soften up the enemy or to batter points of resistance. The cannons were usually 4-pounder, 6-pounder, 8-pounders and 12-pounders, along with 6-inch howitzers. However, the 4-pounders were eventually phased out and replaced with 6-pounders later in the wars. Artillery in the French army, like most of the other armies of the period, was organised into 2 distinct types: foot artillery and horse artillery. Foot artillery was crewed by men who marched alongside their guns, which in turn was pulled by horses. The foot artillery were organised into regiments, from 8 in 1805 to 10 later in the war. Unlike infantry and cavalry, the term regiment was used purely as an administration tool and didn't reflect the size of the unit. The tactical unit was a battery, which was formed of 120 men. This was also known as a company, and these were then formed into brigades, which in turn were assigned to divisions and corps. Each division had a brigade of 3 or 4 batteries, each with 8 guns, made up of 6 cannons and 2 howitzers. The artillery that was assigned to corps was classed as reserve and was made up of 1 or more brigades, and it usually consisted of the larger calibre guns. These could then be assigned to where they were needed during a campaign. Horse artillery, on the other hand, had lighter guns and was more mobile, with the crews either riding horses or on the carriages themselves. With the closeness to which they operated on the front lines, the crews were also armed with infantry weapons and trained for close-quarter combat. As an artillery unit, they were trained to rapidly reach a suitable firing position, unlimber and fire at the enemy formations before limbering their pieces and changing position. There were 6 regiments of horse artillery in La Grande Armée and a further one in the Imperial Guard. But as with the foot artillery, these were administration designations and were assigned to division or corps where they were needed. With their unique status and training, they were expensive to raise and maintain, and only constituted a small percentage of the artillery of La Grande Armée's disposal. The most common artillery ammunition was the round shot, which as the name implies was a cast iron ball. However, as the shot was rarely perfectly spherical and didn't fit the cannon barrels correctly, they were very inaccurate, but the velocity of the round and the mass formations on the battlefield meant that this was not particularly important and they caused great carnage on the enemy. Round shot was used against an enemy at a distance, but as enemy infantry and cavalry closed on the gunners would switch to grape shot and canister. Grape shot comprised a bag filled with iron spheres tied together around a central spindle. Canister was an iron case filled with smaller iron and lead spheres. Both worked in similar ways, designed to burst out over the end of a barrel, similar to a shotgun, and spreading out over a wide area, cutting down an attacking enemy. Mortars and howitzers also fired the common shell, which was a gunpowder-filled sphere, intended to explode at a certain distance set by a rudimentary fuse. Although it was not always effective against personnel, it was largely used in sieges where the distance from the enemy was pretty much static. A final type of artillery ammunition was used, and this was called a carcass or incendiary shot. This was filled with flammable material, the recipe of which changed over time, and was largely used to attack towns where the burning effect would take hold with devastating results. Although the infantry comprised the bulk of La Grande Armée, the cavalry and artillery also had an important and deadly place within it. All 3 operated in combination on the field of battle to the best of their abilities in mutual support. The Imperial Guard had its origins in the Consular Guard of 1799, comprising of about 1,000 men and tasked with providing security to the executive and legislative bodies of the French Republic. However, they did not oppose Napoleon's 18th Brumaire coup in the same year. In 1804, they changed their name to the Imperial Guard, and the size of the formation grew over the following years. The Guard was split into 3 echelons: the Old Guard, Middle Guard, and the Young Guard. This came into effect in 1810. The Old Guard comprised of the oldest and most devoted guardsmen who had accompanied Napoleon on his campaigns, whilst the Middle Guard was created from veterans of the campaigns between 1805 and 1809, and the Young Guard was drawn from the best of the later army intakes, and although they were superior to the rest of the French army, they were not the same calibre as the 2 other Guard formations. Soldiers of the Guard enjoyed a better pay, better rations, better housing than the rest of the French army, and they were also considered to be 1 rank higher than non-Guard soldiers. From the initial 1,000 men, the Guard had risen to 8,000 men by 1804, and then to just under 100,000 men on the eve of the invasion of Russia in 1812. In 1814, the Guard was disbanded, but was rebuilt again by Napoleon in 1815 for the 100 Days campaign. The Guard were present during the Battle of Waterloo, and despite the Middle Guard collapsing in front of the British and Allied firepower, the Old and Young Guard helped cover the retreat of the rest of the army, until they too were almost annihilated by Allied and Prussian cavalry and artillery. The movement of men through the various Guard formations was complex and can be confusing. It was dependent on the date that they joined, the campaigns that they had been in, and other factors. The Old Guard infantry was eventually organised into 4 regiments: the 1st and 2nd Regiments of Grenadiers and the 1st and 2nd Regiments of Chasseurs, and they were formed from the nucleus of the original Guard. Candidates for the Old Guard had several requirements to entry. They had to be at least 35 years old, have 10 years of service, have fought in at least 3 campaigns, had to have faced the enemy fire from the front, and to have been at least 5 foot 8 inches tall for the Chasseurs and 5 foot 11 inches tall for the Grenadiers. However, the height restriction was dropped for those men who had been awarded the Legion of Honour. The Old Guard were known as the Grumblers, les Grognards, as they were known to grumble in Napoleon's presence without the fear of reprisal. As more men were added to the Guard, the Middle Guard was formed. However, until 1811 they were ranked as Young Guard, at which time they were classified as Middle Guard, and then these men joined the Old Guard in 1814 before being disbanded. As with the rest of the Guard, it was raised again for the 100 Days campaign in 1815. The Young Guard were drawn from the best soldiers of the intakes into the Army regiments, and they were more numerous than the other Guard components. For example, in 1814 there were more than 40 regiments of Young Guard. They fought hard in many of Napoleon's campaigns, but they were victims of the invasion of Russia, just like the rest of the Grande Armée. In 1815, and after Napoleon's escape from Elba, the Young Guard was raised again with volunteers, veterans, and other men. The Imperial Guard also consisted of cavalry, making the Guard more like a corps in size. The cavalry was headed by the regiment of Horse Grenadiers. This formation was formed of men from the original Consular Guard, and they wore bearskins like their foot counterparts. They rode black horses and were classed as heavy cavalry despite not wearing a cuirass. Second in seniority was the regiments of Chasseurs à Cheval, created again from the Consular Guard. They usually provided close personal protection to the Emperor himself. Their uniform was lavish, and in recognition to their service, Napoleon wore a version of it. A dragoon regiment was also raised and named the Empress Dragoons in recognition for the dragoon service in Germany in 1805. The regiment wore a similar uniform to the Grenadiers, but it was green in colour and with a copper helmet with a long plume. Very briefly in 1814, 3 regiments of Hussars were added to the Guard cavalry after experience with the Cossacks in Russia. These mounted scouts of the Imperial Guard were intended to be able to scout and act as counterparts to the Cossack threat. With Napoleon's defeat and abdication in 1814, the regiments were disbanded and were never raised again. Also, 3 regiments of Lancers were included in the Imperial Guard, consisting of the 1st Polish Lancers, the 2nd Franco-Dutch Lancers, and the 3rd Lithuanian Lancers. The 1st Lancers were raised after Napoleon's defeat of the Allies and capture of Poland in 1807. They were then renamed the 1st Regiment, when the 2nd Regiment was raised in 1810 from the former Dutch cavalry units. The 2nd were known as the Red Lancers due to their uniforms. Then the 3rd Regiment was raised in Lithuania in 1812 during the invasion of Russia. They were largely destroyed during the retreat from Moscow, however. A squadron of Mamluks also served as cavalry in the Imperial Guard. They were drawn from men who had returned with Napoleon after the 1799 Egyptian campaign. They were never raised higher than a single squadron, and casualties meant the replacements came from other French cavalry units, or ones with vaguely Middle Eastern connections. The Guard cavalry also included units of gendarmes and honour guards, but these were rarely, if ever, used in combat. The Imperial Guard was also supported by both foot and horse artillery batteries. Organised along similar lines to the artillery of the army, the Guard artillery also consisted of mostly 6-pounder and 12-pounder guns. As with Napoleon's Grande Armée, the Imperial Guard met its end during the Waterloo campaign of 1815 and was finally disbanded in September of that year. It had served honourably until the last and had a dedication and servitude to the Emperor that was unmatched by the rest of the French army. The 94th Infantry Regiment inherited the traditions of the Guard after it was disbanded, and they were known as Le Garde until their dissolvement in 1993, when the French army was reorganised. It was subsequently reformed, and the unit wears a beret with a French Imperial Eagle insignia to reflect the long tradition that the regiment is associated with.